The pipe crawler had my forearm in its mandibles, and my grandmother was singing in my mesh.
God, it burns.
Not singing exactly, more like repeating. Her voice looping through the local signal on a frequency that shouldn't exist in a decommissioned server cluster 6 decks below Hanoi's street level. My mesh implant was throwing error codes in my peripheral vision, the toxins spreading up my arm, making everything stutter and double. The corroded pipe I'd pressed my back against was the only solid thing in a world that had decided to become something else entirely. And the voice wouldn't stop.
Bọt biển, một muỗng cà phê muối, nhào đến khi
That's my dead grandmother giving bread instructions in a language I never properly learned. 48 hours earlier, I was just doing my job. Here's what you need to know about Veth Station. The rich live in the core. Clean air, dry floors, mesh that runs at full speed without lag. The rest of us live at the hull edge, where the station is oldest and the seals are original equipment from 2 centuries ago. In Hanoi district, the hull sweats. Condensation runs down every surface. The walls, the vendor stalls, the faces of the people who've been here long enough that they've stopped noticing. You get used to everything being slightly damp. You stop expecting anything to be clean. I grew up in Hanoi and left at 17. Came back 4 years ago because the salvage work is better where the old mesh is thicker. And old mesh means old data. And old data means bombs. Ghost signals in the dead hardware. Most of them aren't worth much. A resident's archived shopping preferences, mesh fragments of conversations that got stuck in a server loop when the hardware was decommissioned. You'd be surprised what people pay for the right fragment. The signal I'd flagged 3 nights ago was different. I do most of my work between 2300 hours and 0400. That's when the district's ambient mesh traffic drops, and the old signals underneath it become audible. Think of it like the station going quiet enough to hear what it's been carrying in its walls all this time. I had Sibby running hardware checks on a decommissioned server cluster below a closed bakery at the corner of Alley 14 and the Bridge of 9 Lamps, while I sat 2 decks up in a noodle stall with my mesh tuned to the passive receive frequency.
I'm reading. Okay, this is strange. The hardware down here is 200 years old, and somehow it's still running a signal loop. Faint, but persistent.
The noodle stall belonged to an old man named Phúc, who'd known me as a child and had the decency not to say so. He kept topping up my broth and watching the street outside with the patience of someone who'd already seen everything twice. I tuned my receive frequency tighter. Static. The particular textured static of hardware that's been running in the dark for a long time, generating heat and signal with nobody home. And then, underneath the static, something organized. A pattern. Not data in any compression format I recognized, something older. It sounded like a voice. I'd pulled bong signals before. Most of them are fragments, 5-10 seconds of looping audio before the pattern breaks down. Whoever the ghost is, whatever they were doing when the mesh captured them, you get a sliver of it and then nothing. This one didn't break down. I sat in Phúc noodle stall for 37 minutes and it kept going. Not repeating, not looping, continuing. As if someone down there in the dead servers was still working. Still kneading bread dough and measuring salt and checking the oven temperature in a bakery that had been closed for 11 years. The bakery at the corner of Alley 14. Tiệm bánh, my grandmother's bakery. I told him I was fine. I closed the receive frequency, paid my tab, and stood in the street outside his stall for a while, looking at the shuttered bakery across the alley. The old signage was still up, faded red and gold, the calligraphy weathered but legible. The oven had gone cold the week Min died. I'd been the one to switch it off. I hadn't been back since. I told myself I wasn't going to do anything with this. I'd run a clean data extraction, file the signal hash, sell it to a broker. Standard salvage. The fact that the signal was coming from under my grandmother's bakery was just geography. I've worked Hanoi district for 4 years. Sooner or later, everything connects to something I used to know. That's the problem with coming home. The mesh here knows all your history. I was still running that logic when my communication node pinged with a message from a name I didn't recognize. Rael Ondath, Acquisition Specialist, Veth Station Data Recovery, licensed and bonded. The message was short.
I know what you found in the Hanoi subservers. I've been tracking it for 3 months. I'd like to discuss acquisition terms before this gets complicated. I'm prepared to offer 40,000 station credit for the signal hash and hardware access rights. That's above market rate, and you know it.
40,000. 3 years of good work compressed into a message from someone who'd been watching the same signal and just, waited to see who else would find it first? The mesh doesn't owe you yesterday. That's what I'd always told myself. You process the data and you move on. That's the job. That's survival. But my grandmother was still down there in the servers, still measuring salt, still doing what she'd done every day of the 30 years I'd known her. And someone else had been watching her ghost for 3 months and hadn't told anyone. I told Sibby to hold the hardware. I told Rael Ondath nothing at all. And I started trying to figure out why my dead grandmother's signal was still running, and what, exactly, she'd been trying to preserve. The server farm below Tien Ban Minh is 6 levels of descent from the street, past the district's utility corridors, through a decommissioned storage vault that smells like fermented grain and old circuitry, and into a space where the station's original hull-adjacent infrastructure still runs on hardware that nobody's upgraded because nobody's used it in decades. Which is also, not coincidentally, prime pipe crawler territory. Eyeless, 6-limbed. They navigate by mesh signal. If you've got an active implant, you are a navigation beacon and a meal source in one convenient package.
We should have brought suppression gear.
We should have done a lot of things. I had a static field generator for my salvage kit. It could mask an implant signal for about 40 meters in any direction, which is fine if you know exactly where the crawlers are and can keep them outside the bubble. It's less fine if there's already one between you and your equipment. The bong signal was stronger down here. I could hear it without even opening my receive frequency. It was bleeding through the standard mesh channels, an old ghost too persistent for the dead hardware to contain. I followed it the way you follow music through a crowded station, by walking toward where it's loudest. The server cluster was in the back of what had once been a supply room for the bakery. The hardware was older than anything I'd pulled signal from before. Original station build, 200 years of continuous operation, never updated, never replaced. The bakery's mesh interface had been installed in this room because it was the only space below street level with a direct hardline connection. And Min had apparently spent decades interfacing with it, baking her bread and running her mesh in the same room, her neural traffic accumulating in the hardware the way heat accumulates in old stone. The signal was everywhere. The room hummed with it.
Wait. There's something behind the left rack.
I heard it before I saw it. The particular flat tap of pipe crawler legs on metal, moving in short, decisive bursts. My static field generator was on, but the signal bleeding from the server cluster was so strong, it was creating interference patterns, pockets of mesh noise that the crawler was reading as separate sources. It wasn't tracking me, it was tracking the ghost, which meant it moved between me and the main server stack before I had time to reconsider my career choices. What happened next took about 6 seconds and felt like considerably longer. The crawler struck fast, mandibles on my left forearm before the static field could register the threat and compensate. I got it off after the first bite. Sibby pinned it against the far wall with a containment canister while I checked my arm. 2 puncture marks, already going numb, the toxin doing what pipe crawler toxin does.
No, BAD. It's bad, but I've had worse. Don't touch it.
Not terrible. The numbness was local. My mesh was throwing warnings. Disruption incoming, memory interface instability flagged. But I was still standing, still thinking. The crawler's toxin works on the mesh interface, not the person. What it does is strip the filters that normally keep incoming mesh data organized and sequential. Everything in the local signal range hits your consciousness raw. And the local signal range was full of my grandmother. The mesh flash lasted 4 minutes by the timestamp. Inside it, time moved differently. I was in the bakery. Not this dead bakery, the living one. The Tien Ben Min of 12 years ago, at 4 in the morning, with the oven going and the smell of real bread. Not synthetic algae bread, but bread made from a culture that Min had been maintaining since before she left Earth. A starter she'd kept alive for 60 years in a sealed jar she carried off the evacuation transport and onto the first shuttle to Veth Station. I could see her hands. I knew her hands, the way you know the back of your own hand, the specific geography of every callus and scar. And she was working. She was always working. But she was also recording. Not a scheduled mesh archive, something deliberate. She was talking while she worked, narrating her own hands, the weight of dough, the feel of gluten developing under pressure, the timing that you can only know by touch. And between the bread instructions, other things. The names of her siblings who didn't make it off Earth, the name of the village her mother was born in, the recipe for a soup that doesn't have a name in any language that exists on Veth Station. She knew she was dying. She knew it for months before she told anyone. And every day she came down to this room and she talked into the mesh, and she let the old hardware absorb it.
What did you see? My grandmother, 11 years ago.
When the flash cleared, I was sitting on the floor of the server room with Sibby crouched in front of me, saying my name.
She encoded a bomb. Deliberately?
My grandmother, 11 years ago. She knew this would happen. She put herself here on purpose.
She built one every day for months.
She built one every day for months. She called it into existence one bread-making session at a time.
What I have, what I need.
The hard drives I'd sold when I cleared the bakery after her death, those had her recipe files, her accounts, her correspondence. The standard digital archive that any business owner keeps. I'd sold them to a data recycler for 40 station credit and hadn't thought about them since. I hadn't known about the mesh servers. I hadn't known she'd spent her last year talking into the walls. I was pulling up the signal hash to start a full extraction when the door of the server room opened. 3 people. One of them I recognized from the professional registry image in his message. Rael Ondath had a legal extraction warrant in his hand and 2 station-licensed hardware technicians behind him. He looked around the room with the expression of someone who'd been working toward something for a long time and had arrived.
You knew this was coming. The server must be decommissioned.
You don't have the authority.
He does. We're here to enforce it. Stand aside.
He smiled when he said professional. The kind of smile that's been polished smooth by 10 years of being technically correct. My grandmother was in those servers. All of her last year. All the names she didn't want to lose. And he had a piece of paper that said it belonged to him. The data salvage protocols are a mess of legislation that was written in the station's 2nd generation, when nobody had figured out yet that bongs were going to be a thing. The law treats them as hardware artifacts, data that happens to be shaped like a person, which means whoever owns the hardware owns the ghost. Rael Ondath owned the hardware. He'd bought the subspace salvage rights to this entire server cluster 3 months ago. The same 3 months he'd spent tracking the signal, waiting to see if it was worth the cost of the warrant.
We could contest the warrant. Ground of insufficient notice.
The notice requirement is 48 hours. He's within it. We can't stop the extraction.
The warrant is contesting on grounds of insufficient notice, but I know it's not enough.
I started running the math. Sib had a portable mesh bridge, capable of copying signal from hardware to a transit drive. The problem was bandwidth. A BOM of Min's complexity and duration, 11 years of accumulated signal, wasn't going to copy in 20 minutes on portable hardware. Not even close. We'd get fragments. The opening few seconds of 100 different recordings, all of them cut off mid-word. A ghost of the ghost. The extraction team was setting up their equipment at the far end of the server room. Rael was reviewing documentation on his mesh interface, not looking at me. Professional, organized, entirely unbothered.
For what it's worth, I'll be selling this to a collector who specializes in pre-diaspora cultural memory artifacts. It won't disappear, it'll be preserved.
In a private archive that nobody in Hanoi will ever access.
To everyone. I know exactly what you did.
In an archive that will still exist when this station has been decommissioned and recycled, which, given Beth's
He wasn't wrong,
is not a far-off
and that
scenario.
made it worse. The voice from the doorway was old and unhurried, the way you can only be unhurried when you've been standing still for a very long time. Fook was standing in the doorway with a thermos of tea, because of course he was. He'd known. He'd known the bakery's servers still held a signal. He'd told nobody because, as he explained, setting down the thermos on a relatively clean section of server housing, he didn't know what the right thing to do was. And he'd rather do nothing than do the wrong thing. She did. I tried the copy anyway. Sibba ran the mesh bridge at maximum transfer rate while Rael's team worked from the other end, and I stood in the middle, being technically within my rights as an observer and practically useless. The copy counter ran 9%, 14%. The extraction team was already pulling the first physical server rack from the housing. 19%. 22. The racks came out one by one. The ambient signal in the room, my grandmother's voice, still baking in the walls, still measuring salt, dropped a notch every time a rack disconnected. Like turning down the volume on something that had been playing for so long you'd stop noticing it. 26%. The copy froze. Bandwidth cap on the portable bridge. Sibby shook her head at me.
That's all we're going to get.
26% of my grandmother's last year. The other 74% was going into a carrying case to be shipped to a collector's archive on a station 3 jump points away. The maintenance terminal in the corner of the room, old station equipment, the kind that's been in every utility space since the station's founding, lit up blue-white. The station's infrastructure, AI V3I-7.
Ms. Dalveth, I should have flagged this earlier, but I've been uncertain of the appropriate protocol. For the past 11 years, I have been accumulating overflow data from this server cluster as part of my standard maintenance routing. The overflow has been unusually consistent in its pattern. I did not recognize it as a bong signal until you identified it this evening. My logs contain approximately 40% of the complete archive.
40%.
Combined with the 26% Ms. Sib has captured, you would have 66% of the complete archive. This data is accumulated within my maintenance logs, which exist outside the scope of Mr. Ondath's warrant, which specifies only the hardware in this subspace.
Are you offering to share it with me?
I'm flagging a data irregularity in my logs that requires resolution. What you do with that information is beyond my operational scope. I thought you should know it existed.
66%. Not complete. Not the whole of what she put in the walls, but more than a fragment. More than 26% of a voice cutting off mid-word. And here was the thing Rael Ondath had said, which I hadn't been able to shake. He wasn't wrong. a private archive preserves. A signal on Hanoi's local mesh, the open district mesh that anyone can hear, runs until it degrades, which on aging hardware like VETH37s is maybe another 20 years, maybe less. A collector's archive runs indefinitely. My grandmother chose the walls. She chose to put herself somewhere that the district could hear her, not somewhere she'd last forever, somewhere she'd be present. I knew what she would have wanted. I just had to decide if I was willing to do it the same way she did. I asked Rael if he'd take 66%.
You know what I'm asking for. Then not.
I'm not selling you the rest. The 40% in VETHRI7's logs belongs to the station infrastructure, not to that hardware. You said so yourself when you described the scope of your warrant. I'm not interfering with your extraction. Take the 74% you've pulled from the racks. I'll keep the rest.
And do what with it?
That was the question. I had spent 4 years in Hanoi district processing old data and not asking what it had meant to the people who made it. That's the job. That's how you stay functional. You don't think about the person who used to live in a particular server cluster. You think about the signal, the hash value, the market rate. You process and you move on. My grandmother didn't process and move on. She stood in a room with old hardware and she talked. She talked about bread. She talked about the people she'd lost. She talked about the recipe that doesn't have a name anymore because the language it was named in hasn't been spoken fluently in Hanoi district for 15 years. She talked as if someone might be listening, as if the walls might hold it, the way bread holds the shape of the pan that baked it. I'm a signal salvager. I know that bongs aren't people. They don't experience anything. They repeat. They're data in the shape of memory, not the actual thing. I know this the way I know anything technical, with the confidence of someone who studied the mechanism and understood how it works. But my grandmother was still measuring salt in the walls of this server room. Still, after 11 years. Still doing what she did every day of her life because she'd decided at the end of it that this was worth preserving. I called up VETHRI7 on the terminal.
Yes, Ms. Dalveth.
I want to transmit the signal data from your maintenance logs to the open district mesh. Hanoi local, unencrypted, no access controls.
That would be a public broadcast, accessible to any mesh-connected resident of Hanoi district.
Can you do it?
The data is in my logs. I can classify it as a maintenance broadcast. It would run on the ambient frequency at low intensity, audible to anyone listening on the open channel, not intrusive to anyone who isn't. It would persist until the data degrades naturally or a station administrator orders it cleared.
How long?
Accounting for current hardware state and maintenance projections, between 15 and 20 years, possibly longer.
Not forever. Not a collector's archive running indefinitely in climate-controlled preservation. 15 to 20 years. In the walls of a district that was slowly losing the thread of what it used to be. Heard by whatever residents happened to be tuned to the right frequency at the right time. Some of them would hear my grandmother's voice and not know whose it was. Some would walk past the open channel and tune it out without listening. Some might stop. My grandmother had built a ghost. She'd decided that the right place for her memory was somewhere it could be found, not somewhere it would be kept. The difference matters. Kept things go into boxes. Found things get to be present. Do it. The signal went out onto the mesh at 3:15 in the morning. I stood in the doorway of the old server room while Rael's team finished packing the last rack for transport, and I listened to what VETHRI7 was broadcasting on the ambient channel. My grandmother's voice, asking the walls how much salt was too much salt, then answering her own question, then correcting the answer. The hum of her oven, 11 years gone, still present as a harmonic in the recorded signal. Phúc had his thermos and was sitting on a server housing, eyes closed, listening. He looked like a man who'd been waiting for something to come back and was trying not to make a big production of it. I went back up to the street level through the utility corridors. Hanoi at 0300. The vendors who keep late hours, a few residents moving between shifts, the constant drip of condensation from the hull joints. I walked to the corner of Alley 14 and stood outside the shuttered bakery. The old signage looked the same as it had 11 years ago when I switched off the oven. The sign was faded. The calligraphy still readable. If you tuned to the open ambient channel right now, and you were standing close enough to the old hardware in the walls, you could hear her. Not words, not clearly, just the texture of someone working. The particular rhythm of hands doing something they've done 10,000 times, which sounds different from hands doing something for the first time. More settled, more certain, more completely itself. I don't know if that's legacy. I don't know if 15 to 20 years in the walls of a district counts as something owed, or something given, or something taken, or something that just happens the way condensation happens. The past leaking into the present through the places where the seals were never quite tight enough. What I know is this: she chose the walls. She chose the district. She chose somewhere she might be found over somewhere she'd certainly be kept. That was her call to make, and she made it. I don't know if I made the right call tonight. I sent 66% of her last year out onto a public channel where it'll degrade over the next 2 decades. Rael has 74% of a full archive that will outlast this station by centuries. Between the two of us, we've divided her ghost the way you divide an inheritance, each party getting something, neither party getting everything. The mesh doesn't owe you yesterday. That's what I always said. She built yesterday into the mesh, and she left it there for me to find. 11 years of it, accumulating in the walls of a room I didn't know to look in.
The narration shifts to its final reckoning. She built yesterday.
I went home when the station's simulated dawn cycle kicked on, and the lighting shifted from 2/3 power to full. Hanoi's streets turned from amber dark to warm gold. The vendor stalls opened. Someone 3 alleys over was frying something that smelled like the synthetic algae bread version of the thing my grandmother used to make. The approximation, the echo of it. The version that still exists because the original was real enough to leave a shape in the world. Maybe that's what legacy is. Not the preservation of the thing, but the shape it leaves. The indent in the mattress after the person is gone. The humidity in the walls. The frequency that sounds like someone who used to be here, still measuring salt, still checking the oven. Somewhere in the walls of Hanoi district, at a frequency just below the standard mesh traffic, my grandmother is still baking. I don't know if anyone will listen. I don't know if it matters whether they do. I don't know if the not knowing is the answer, or just the question I haven't solved yet. The rain tastes like ozone. The streets are wet. The bakery sign is fading. She's still in there.